everybody. I am Julie Matheny. I am a speech pathologist and IBCLC International Board Certified Lactation Consultant. And I am really excited today to talk to Solid Starts, all about all things solid foods and breastfeeding and infant development. So it's just now 10 o'clock. I am going to see if here. Going to have my friend join me. Sometimes it's funny. These Instagram lives are always funny in how they accept. There we go. Here we go.
Hi.
Yay! How are
Happy to be
you?
here. I have to say, as I'm looking out my window at the snow, I am so jealous of you in California right now.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. Yes, now remind me, where are you located right now?
Now I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I grew up in Southern California, LA area, and then moved here to be closer to my husband's family. And it's just it's a trip. It's wild.
Oh, that's so funny because I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Okay.
So my parents are still back there. And I actually think years ago I had you on my referral list when you were still in LA.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
crazy.
I know, right? So such a small world, but I am so thankful that you came on. Can you tell me now? I know who you are. Can you tell everybody who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Absolutely. So for everybody that's in the LA lactation community, my name is Kim Grenowitzky. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist and international board certified lactation consultant, like Julie had mentioned to begin with. And I am one of the senior feeding therapists over at Solid Start. So our entire purpose is to help families introduce solid foods to their babies in a safe way that feels good to them. So we have a completely free app where you can look up how to cut pretty much almost any food you can think of and provide it safely for your baby. And we're trying to do as much education as we can about responsive feeding, and whether that is letting your baby grab the spoon and feed them with puree, or if that is letting them feed themselves the same food that you serve your family. We're here for it. So we've got, like I said, the free app. We've got tons of guides and resources on our website. And, as the lactation consultant in me and a mom who exclusively breastfed two babies, I'm very, very motivated by and excited to talk about this, breastfeeding and pumping and bottle feeding and solids and what do you do and when do you cut down and just all the changes that go along with that. So I'm really excited to be here and talk to you.
So did you start as the OT first and then transition to lactation, or what was your journey like in that feeding space? Because we are unicorns, let's be honest.
Yeah, I know.
OT, PT, speech, occupational physical speech therapists who make the transition into lactation, there aren't very many of us. So when we meet, it's like, yeah, unicorns. Tell me about your journey.
So nice. So I've always worked in pediatric acute care until this, weird startup life that I work in now. But in my roles in children's hospitals, I was always working with mom and baby dyads. So I was working in the NICU and in the cardiac ICU, and we were doing lots of helping moms get baby in their arms for the first time, helping get babies to breast for the first time. And I had the feeding knowledge and I had the underlying swallow assessment knowledge, but there was this piece that was missing. I felt like I could help with the developmental handling to get the mom to hold the baby appropriately, but there was just this piece that I felt like I needed to be able to support the mom in establishing and maintaining a milk supply, and also helping these really complicated latch issues, which are a little bit different than IBCLCs in the community see. The latch issue for an extremely premature baby, or even a baby with a cardiac defect, or a baby that we're just doing some exploratory breastfeeding with that has a cleft lip or a palate, is very, very different than what you would see in community-based lactation. So it kind of was like a perfect marriage of the two. And then I had my own babies, and it just kind of worked out, using all that knowledge with my own 36-weeker that was born with all the like little late preterm things that we see, the sugar issues and the jaundice and just those, small little late preterm stuff that needs a little bit of a different approach when it comes to establishing lactation. So I just wanted to be able to support both sides in a really holistic way.
And are you still treating babies now, or are you mostly just doing the solid starts?
Right now, I am fully Solid Starts. We actually just are just about to turn in to Penguin Random House our first book, which is amazing. So we've been doing lots of writing, and that's something that I always dreamed of, but never really knew how to even go there. So my co-partner, Carrie, the other half of my therapist team, we've just been like digging into all the data and also writing this really flowery theoretical stuff that really matters to us as people about connection and meal times and how eating with your baby brings you together on a level that you don't even realize, and how such it's a beautiful dance between a caregiver and a baby. So we've been writing that. And like I mentioned, I moved. So I moved a little over a year and a half ago now and had a second baby. And so we've just been kind of like surfing the startup world. But I do know that I have an inkling to get back into baby care, and I know it's in my future. So I'm going to do this for a little while, but then I know the hospital is calling my name one day.
That's amazing. Well, I can't wait till that comes out, because you better believe I will purchase that for my bookshelf. So excited for that. So let's kind of dive in a little bit more on what people have questions about, right? One of the big things, because I'm also have that acute care background, worked in NICU, transitioned into younger and younger babies. So my population is like 0 to 6 months. We're really working on breastfeeding and feeding. And then the solid starts really kind of picks up once they start those solid foods. Tell us a little bit about, because the big question I get is, when should I introduce solid foods? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So when to start solids traditionally has just been kind of when your pediatrician tells you, right? And a lot of times with that 4-month appointment, pediatricians will say, okay, it's time to start solids, let's get going. But if you actually dig a little deeper and you're like, why should we start solids? It's kind of like, that's just how it's always been done, or that's what the handout from Gerber told me to do. And when you start digging into the research, surprise, surprise, like everything in pediatrics, there's really not any good studies that tell us you should be doing this at a certain time. For sure, there's a benefit of doing it at this time versus the next. So we had to get a little deeper. If you think about nutrition, which I know a lot of people, of course, put on the forefront of their thinking that solids are about nutrition. We do know that a baby's iron stores, especially those that are exclusively breastfed, do start to dwindle around that 6-month mark. So offering solid foods around 6 months to help bolster that iron intake is, something to consider. But we can't get a baby to eat iron-rich foods if they don't have what we consider developmental readiness to eat those foods. So it doesn't matter if you offer, the most iron-rich food every single meal of the day. If they're not interested and they don't have the motor skills to eat it, it's a fool's errand. So when we think about developmental readiness for solids, we want to make sure that they have the motor skills to support their entire body to eat. And those motor skills that support the body to eat, as you know, support our swallowing muscles as well. So one of these nerdy therapy things that I'm sure you've told a million clients of your own is what happens at the hips happens at the lips. So we want to make sure that the entire baby's body is nice and stable so that they can do the hard work of chewing and swallowing food. In that case, we're thinking about a baby that can sit almost independently. I'm not saying they have to be absolutely perfect sitters, never toppling over. But if they're in the high chair, you want them to be able to sit there and pick something up off the tray and bring it to their mouth. This tends to happen around 6 months. My first daughter was like 6.5 months before she could do this. But again, she was born a little early. My second daughter has always kind of been a crazy motor baby and was walking at 10 months. She was showing this at 5 months. It's just very different. Every baby's a little different there. We also want to be able to have them bring those hands to mouth in sitting. So a lot of times you'll put a baby in the high chair and they look like they're sitting great. You're like, oh, look. But then you give them something to grab and they're like, ooh, can't get it. So you have to, and again, like a silly therapy term, they have to be able to disassociate their arms from their body, right? So in the beginning, you see them like, I can sit, I can do it, I'm here. But then you ask them to do anything else and like you demonstrated, then they're like, oh, can't do it all at the same time.
Yeah.
So that self-feeding aspect is really important for two things. Number one, choking risk. We know the data in the adult population started to tell us, I think of the first studies looking at this were like 10 or 15 years ago, that self-feeding decreases choking risk because they found that in nursing homes, when residents fed themselves, they had less choking issues. The Bliss study that specifically looked at self-feeding finger foods confirmed this, that when food was placed in a baby's mouth, the risk of choking increased. And so we do always want to encourage self-feeding of the food, so being able to pick up the food and bring it to the mouth. But the thing that I think is not talked about enough, and it ties into this third sign of readiness, is it shows interest and engagement. So we think all the time with like, you can't force a baby to breastfeed, right? It would be very, very challenging to force a baby to latch and actually breastfeed. We don't want to do anything that's going to force a baby to eat solids either. And when they're picking up the food and bringing it to their own mouth, they're actively engaged in that process. And they're taking that step of being like, no, I want to do this. I'm really excited to do this. This is mine. I'm in control. So that being able to feed themselves demonstrates the third sign of readiness, which is just interest. You bring your like 3-month-old baby to the table and they're like, this is kind of interesting. I'm gonna fall asleep. Maybe I'll nurse. Like, okay. You bring your 6-month-old baby to the table and they're like, what are you doing? Like, I'm gonna watch that spoon. I'm gonna watch what you're putting in your mouth. And hey, I'm gonna like try to crawl on the table and get it from you.
So then what would you tell parents that are like my 4-month-old who's not sitting supported yet, is really super wobbly, and but they're showing interest? That's the question that I get, because I'm like, yes, everything she's saying is exactly what I teach. Woohoo! But you'll often hear those parents that are like, well, my 4-month-old is showing the signs of readiness but not meeting the other skills. What are you telling parents with those babies?
That's such a great question. We hear the same thing too. And I guess I have two like approaches to this. My number one approach is always safety. From a safety perspective, from a swallowing perspective, that motor skill is really, really important. It's incredible that your baby is showing all of this interest at 4 months, and that is going to help you. That is going to benefit you. Absolutely. I see so many babies that don't show that interest, so you've already checked that off the list. But the feeding therapist in me can't deny the fact that your baby is going to be safer if we wait a little bit until they have better skills. In addition, they may be really interested in watching you eat, but I wonder if they were actually provided the opportunity to engage with something, whether they'd be able to do it or not. Yeah. Now, the other side of this is there is an emerging body of literature looking at this idea of taste training, which is a little bit less applicable to a lactation community, because as many of you may know, the breast milk that your babies drink actually exposes them to the flavors that you eat, which is super cool. In a formula fed baby, their exposure is very uniform, right? They're getting the same flavors every single time. And so there is some literature looking at, is there a benefit of exposing babies to tastes of foods early during that 4 to 6 month old window to see if it expands their flavor preferences later? None of this research has been crazy high quality. None has shown anything like mind-blowingly different, but what it has told us is that in general, exposing babies to a variety of foods early and often is key. There's still no definition of what early means.
Yeah.
So I think that we also can ask too, like, do you want to get started at 4 months because it just feels really exciting for you and it's something you want to do, or do you feel pressure about it? Kind of doing that, just asking that question of why do you want to start? And if it's something that they just feel really motivated by and it makes them feel really, engaged with their baby and their baby wants to do it, I don't see any problem in exploring little tastes of things off fingers. Like we were at lunch the other day and I saw this little baby sitting on her dad's lap, and she was definitely not old enough to be fully eating, but her dad was giving her some like tastes of things off his plate, off her finger or off his finger. And I was like, you know what, that's amazing. And that's such a great way for that baby dad dyad to be able to do something fun together. It wasn't by any means like spoon feeding, full amounts of food, but as long as baby is engaged and interested, and it's nothing that's like fully looking unsafe to me, I don't really see any reason why they can't have little.
I love that 5-month lick, right? Like I think 5 months is when we did lemon. And it was that like, whoa, what is that flavor in the mouth? Because it wasn't like, we're not pushing volume at that age, you're pushing experience.
Totally.
I think that's a lot of the big thing of early introduction is that definition of developmentally ready and appropriate versus exploratory safe experience. And the reason why, right? Like, is your baby a full-term healthy baby that's developmentally appropriate, meeting milestones on time? Do you have a suspicion of an allergy? A lot of parents are like, how do I navigate that introduction and exploratory phase when you're dealing with that too?
Yeah, totally. And the AAAAI, I give enough A's, the asthma allergy group has recently come out and said in babies that have high risk for allergy, we do want to introduce peanut and egg in that 4 to 6 month bracket, which can be challenging for a baby that doesn't have readiness. And so how can we do this in a safe way? A lot of times that just means positioning, making sure that they're engaged, opening their mouths, showing interest, because of course we don't want to be forcing it in on them.
Peanut butter for a 4-month-old, you're like, because I get that question a lot too. Of my pediatrician told me to introduce the high allergens between 4 to 6 months, but they're not ready. But how do I do a high allergen food when I haven't even introduced them to a non-allergen food?
Right, totally. And I feel like this is a very a thing that we hear a lot from parents, because obviously everyone falls on the spectrum of more anxious to less anxious as a parent. And if you're feeling really anxious as a parent, the first experience with food, I would hate that to be an allergen that happened to give your baby a reaction. I feel like that would just create such a negative experience around the idea of eating. If you are not nervous about allergens, okay, go ahead. I can totally understand why you want to do that first. But if you're already feeling anxious about allergens or just about solids in general, that could really set you up for a challenging feeding experience.
Yeah, for sure. Which brings me to my next question, because I have a list of foods that I normally recommend as like first foods. Rice cereal, we know, is like, we're trying to avoid that now. The new literature is like, yeah, we shouldn't be doing rice cereal or infant cereals. It's a highly processed food. Some of them could have arsenic levels, other issues with them. So I kind of have in my clinical mind the most hypoallergenic easy foods based on property of the food. I'm curious to hear what your first food introduction list, if we could do a side-by-side comparison of your first, where
totally.
we're at with that.
So I might throw a wrench in this, because my first answer, or my immediate answer to that question, is I like to encourage people to introduce something that's really important to them.
That's great.
So I'll give you a little aside, but when I was pregnant with my first, the first time I felt her move was when I was eating pineapple. And so her first food was pineapple, because to me that felt like it was bringing this really special thing to her. My second, we had just moved to Michigan and I was really craving my Southern California roots. My first food for my second baby was Taco Tuesday. So she had a strip of steak and a strip of bell pepper.
Nice. That's amazing.
Does that answer everybody's questions about nutrition and safety? No, it doesn't. But I do think it's important for everybody to remember that this is one of those really fun, like, I hate to use the word, but it's a core memory, right? Is remembering coming to the table with your baby for the first time and sharing food that matters to you. Now, okay, that's my crunchy mom, comment that I have to say, because I do think it's important. But then when it comes to a first food, you can think about it two different ways. Of course, you can think about it from a nutrition lens. So you want to think about things that offer experiences with iron and zinc are kind of the two that are really the most important. But then we also want to think safety. So if you're feeling super anxious, I like to go with either something that's pureed or mashed that can be either offered on the table or a bowl or on a preloaded spoon that the baby can feed themselves. So that can be anything from avocado to oatmeal, which if we want to go down the FPIES discussion with those foods, we can, but that's a whole other discussion. Or even Greek yogurt. Again, it's an allergen, but it can be a nice thing that sticks to a spoon really well. Or I also like to go the complete opposite direction with resistive food teethers. So something like what my daughter had, which was a pineapple core. They're not going to eat it. They're not going to chew it, but they're literally just using it as a teether to help stimulate those chewing reflexes to build chewing skills. So those are kind of the two buckets that I like to go in. This just made me think of something else that popped into my head when you were talking about that 4 to 6 month window. And, my pediatrician told me to start. And especially from a breastfeeding perspective, I worry sometimes when those babies get started on lots and lots of solids that their nursing or their bottle feed's going to drop. And it's really, really early for that to happen. And I think, especially in babies that are maybe a little bit slower to gain, they're having a little bit of trouble with weight gain, that can sometimes be thrown out as like, let's get them started on solids. And I always get worried about that, because that breast milk and formula, if you're doing formula, is a incredible source of nutrition. And that's what we want our babies to be taking a lot of. And I worry when purees get really going early on that their bellies are going to start getting like, oh, I can fill myself up with this really tasty applesauce. I don't need to nurse as much, or I'm not going to take as much from the bottle. Sorry for that aside, but I meant to say that earlier.
No, that's back in my head. No, I think it's a really valid point for sure.
Like, do you feel like you see moms coming to you with like clogged ducts and mastitis issues when they start offering more purees? And
interesting thing, because I do feel like culturally, regionally, you'll see differences in things, right? Like LA, we have two parent working families where mom often is going back to work, and there's also sleep training on board too because of the exhaustion of working. Now that's nationwide, but obviously you still have pockets depending on where you're at in the country. And so I see a lot of this 4-month appointment. Okay, go ahead with solids, and your baby should be taking 6 to 8 ounce bottles, 6 to 8 ounce feedings, and sleeping at least 10 to 12 hours overnight. which you and I both know is not developmentally appropriate. There's no science to back that up. So it then coincides with, we start solid foods, we're pushing sleep training, the milk supply drops, the weight gain drops, and we're like, oh, what happened? And then they just start doing more and more solid foods. And for some, they can do that okay. And for many, it's like, ooh, we've opened a whole Pandora's box.
Man, I feel like we could rabbit hole about that all day long. As the mom of, I mean, my second now pretty much sleeps through the night at 16 months, but my 3.5-year-old still to this day has not slept through the night. But that's a whole other discussion.
My 4-year-old just now is finally sleeping through the night.
So you're telling me it's on the horizon.
It's on the horizon. It happened with Elf on the Shelf because we told her the magic couldn't happen if she got up in the middle of the night. And for whatever reason, she hook, line, and sinker. At 4 years old, she was getting up sometime between midnight and 2 and trying to come in bed because she was lonely or sad. Yeah. And Elfie on the Shelfie, Elfie McShelfie fixed it for us. She really did believe that the magic of the elf was more important to her than coming in bed.
That's funny. Well, maybe this holiday season is when it's going to happen for us. She'll be 4 in August, so I guess we're like right there. Oh, that's so funny. Elf on the Shelf solved your sleep problem. Anyway, sorry, to go back to what you were talking about, your list of favorite first foods. So in our first 100 days guide that we have for solid starts, a stalk of broccoli is the first food. It is a really great, it's easy for a baby to reach and grasp. It's got that nice stalk to hold on to, but when it's steamed, it's also cooked to be really soft so it can be easily mashed with the baby's tongue and gums, and that most parents can feel pretty comfortable. It doesn't lead to a ton of gagging. It can be a really great exposure. I also love the fact that it's green. We, especially with toddlers, are telling every kid, no, don't put that in your mouth. Don't eat that. That's grass. And a lot of those things are green. And so we wonder why our kids are not as interested in the like herbs and the veggies and stuff. So I truly believe there is this component of like expose green early and often because we want them to know that green is also food. So broccoli is one of the ones that I love. I also love doing the strip of steak because that does give you a lot of iron exposure. Even just sucking on the juices is really great. And it's one of those things that's not going to break apart in their mouth. Even if they have little bunny teeth, you're not going to see a lot of actual munching. Yeah. But that tongue is doing so much beautiful work, as are the gums. And so they're getting nice exposure.
It's interesting because very early on in my speech career, I was on an intensive pediatric feeding team, transitioning from tube to oral feeding. Mm-hmm. And we did extensive training on food properties. And it was all about puree versus gritty, finely chopped, moist, minced, all of these different. So that in my clinical brain, that's still stuck in there from decades ago. And it really is for me when I'm educating first food. Sweet potato and canned pears tend to be two of the first ones because low risk of allergens there. But it's the same concept of like food preparation. You can take a cooked sweet potato and cut it into a strip. Yep. You can take a canned pear, cut it into a strip, but they puree so smooth, no lumps.
Easily fork mash that, and then that's like super fun for your baby too, to like put their hands in, bring it to their mouth, explore it. That's awesome.
And for those that don't have that, for those parents out there that don't have the clinical mind, I basically break it down into put it in your mouth and see what you need to do in order to safely swallow it. Do you actually have to move it to your molars and chew it? Can you just suck on it? Can you take it and smash it with your tongue? If you can say, yes, all I need to do is, because a lot of parents are saying, well, my 7-month-old still doesn't have teeth. Is it safe to be doing these foods? So then it's thinking about, well, what do you actually need to do with this food in order to break it down to safely swallow?
And I think the interesting thing, since you mentioned teeth, that we could talk about here too, is the teeth that we actually use for grinding are our molars. And we don't get molars until toddlerhood, right? So if we were waiting for teeth, our gastroenterologist on our team, her middle daughter didn't get a tooth period until 18 months. Her first tooth came at 18 months. Like teething is such an odd, random thing as to when they erupt. So if we were waiting until teeth, and specifically those grinders, molars, to actually introduce food that has any sort of texture require chewing, we'd be really pushing out introducing food. And there's a really cool body of literature that looks at this window of opportunity where babies have really high strong skill or reflexes for building chewing skills, and they also have a high openness to be interested in trying tasting new things. That window slowly starts to close as they get closer to a year. And for anybody here that's a parent of a toddler, you know that they are definitely not in that interested window in toddlerhood because they're afraid of anything they haven't been exposed to yet. And even the foods that they have been exposed to, they're kind of like, not today. Um, so yeah, using like, or thinking about that idea that those teeth that we really use to grind and tear don't really pop up until much later on.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I love the fact that you mentioned that study about the choking, because I think it's really just so important of safely preparing those foods where, you're finding the right food that fits for your family, things that are off of your table, preparing them. And that's why I love solid starts too, right? Because you're giving parents different ideas of how to safely do that by age and stage because of that exact reason. We know that there's no teeth there. They're
Right.
coming, they might be here, they might not be here, but don't be afraid to jump in and start those foods.
And because there's no good, we had our team meeting recently and we were talking through our kind of how we make decisions about the database. And there is no like perfect evidence-based correlation of like how to make a food safe at a certain age. You can read different recommendations from every different governing body, and honestly, none of them have any research to back them up. And so when we started talking about how to make these how to cut recommendations, we really looked at the underlying characteristics of the food, the underlying skill set of the baby, and then what we do know about safety. So when it comes to it, number one thing we always want to do is decrease or eliminate the aspects of the food that would make it a choking risk. So things like firmness, with the exception of things that are not going to break apart at all. So they're basically a teether. It's like a toy. But firmness, slipperiness, roundness, springiness, which is one that people don't think about a lot, but that like kind of rubbery, springy nature that think about like the consistency of a marshmallow. And then one other thing is film, like the film-like quality. So something that like could be like sucked into the airway, kind of like a Band-Aid or a balloon kind of consistency. So our first approach is always eliminate or decrease that quality of the food, which would mean, chopping round food into a different shape, cutting off the tapered end of a piece of food, cooking it until it's soft, those kind of things. The second component is, what are we going to do to build oral motor skills? How can we help to stimulate those chewing reflexes to actually get the baby to practice chewing over and over? And then the third, and in my mind for the busy parent, especially you're talking about two working parents in a household, which most of us have, how do we make it easy? How do we make this something? I don't want you to have to get out your ruler and like, and think about, doing a math problem and like doing a geometry homework to make food for your baby. We want to be able to be like, this is what I'm serving for me. Is there some sort of like mild adaptation that I can make sure that this would be safe for baby?
Yeah, for sure. Other thing that's really important is there's so much information out there. There's so much social media. There's so much Google, YouTube, all of these sources. I think sometimes parents are so focused on what they see others doing and is recommended that they forget that they are the expert in their baby.
100%.
They are the expert in their food and their table and what they have been eating as a family, what's accessible to them. And I think it's coming back and reflecting in of trust yourself as a parent. You know your baby best. If you're like, oh, my baby drools all the time and they have a really weak latch and they're not very interested and I don't see them mouth their hands very much, that's a very different food introduction than a mom that says my baby's a barracuda and they have a really strong latch and they're biting me all the time and I just feel they're aggressive, everything is in that baby's mouth. Those are two very different babies that even though we can be presented things on social media, pediatrician, a lactation consultant, a lot of times it's like, no, trust yourself. If you feel like that's a good food for your baby, think critically about how you could prepare it safely for your baby. And if you see something and you're like, this doesn't resonate with me, I don't think my baby could do that, trust that. Don't just do something because you saw it on TikTok.
100%. And we actually have an entire chapter in the book about trust. Because when it comes to feeding, I think in the breastfeeding world, we have to trust our bodies, right? Because you have to trust our body that we're making enough milk for our baby. We have to trust that our baby has the skills to be able to express milk from the breast. There's a lot of trust in that dance in the mother-baby dyad. But then when we get to table food, a lot of that trust stuff kind of crumbles, or we forget that there's also a trust relationship there. You're trusting that you know what's best for your baby and your family, and you're also trusting that your baby has skills. Like your baby is really impressive, and you know what your baby can do. So there's this beautiful dance of you bringing your trust in your baby and your trust in yourself. So when you sit down, your baby's like, I got this, mom. Like, I can do this. And it's this really beautiful back and forth. And I love that you brought up trust. It's such an
Well,
important.
and then tied in with that, know yourself, know you, know your baby, know your family, your food, all of that. Take an infant CPR class.
Mhm.
And I can't recommend that highly enough. The American Red Cross often has them. There's many community centers. A lot of public libraries will offer them. If you're here in LA, Here for You CPR. Alan is one of my favorites. He comes and teaches for me a couple times a year for my families and parents, because if you have any questions or concerns about what to do, God forbid, should that actually happen, having that class under your belt can really be a lifesaver.
100%. We've got free downloadable guides if you're a person that just likes to read and look at stuff on infant and toddler choking rescue and CPR. It's got pictures. Our pediatrician put it together. It's really beautiful. But getting in a class where you can actually practice hands-on with a doll is so important. I think when we hear about choking events, true choking events, they typically are in toddlers, and they're toddlers that are on the go. They're at picnics. They're running around, and they put something in their mouth, and the unthinkable happens. Um, but knowing what to do and being able to jump into action really, and I hate to use this word, but it's true, aggressively
Yeah.
is key, especially when practicing, thinking about doing back blows on an infant. Like it feels so painful to think about hitting a baby, but if your baby is truly choking on something, the amount of force that you really should be putting during those back blows is pretty intense.
Yeah.
So being able to sit in a class, if you can bring somebody in or you can go to an actual class and practice on a doll, I think is helpful. So if and when the unthinkable happens, you know. And when your baby hits that 9 to 12 month window, that's always when I get the most nervous about choking, because they are crawling around the house, they've got their little pincer grasp, and they're going to pick up everything. A Barbie shoe, like the thing that makes me so nervous, and it's not going to block an airway, but it's definitely going to cause problems, are the little plastic tags that attach paper tags to stuffed animals and things, because those go in their mouth, they try to swallow them. Again, it's not going to occlude the airway, but that's absolutely problematic. I worry about button batteries, water beads, things that are randomly on the floor. My toddler, my older daughter, has marbles for one of her games, and it's like, when the baby is around, you are not allowed to have that game out, because all that has to happen, that goes in the mouth, one uncoordinated swallow, and bam.
Yeah, the other
So
one
those,
that people don't think about are those dang water beads,
mhm.
those little teeny tiny water beads that you put in water and then they expand. Because you could have your infant put that dry water bead in their mouth and swallow it, and it's going to expand in their stomach.
Water beads are terrifying.
Yeah.
So like if you want to play with water beads, you do that, but you make sure that your child is old enough to know that those do not go in their mouth, that is in a contained space, that they're not going to end up on the floor, that another child could pick up. Yeah, water beads are kind of in the same bucket as button batteries to me. Like those are the scary ones.
Yeah, those are scary for sure. Kind of circling back around to tie in the solids with breastfeeding too. Another big question I get asked is, how much breast milk should the baby still be taking as we're introducing solid foods?
Mm-hmm.
And it really should be that from a lactation perspective, you're looking still breast milk or formula are primary source of nutrition until 1. And you'll often hear that kitschy food before 1 is just for fun, which that has its time and place, right? But yes, breast milk and formula are still primary source of nutrition. You'll hear kind of a range still, and I think that confuses parents of it's like 25 to 30 ounces of breast milk, 25 to 32 formula, with all these kinds of numbers. But that's still primary nutrition, and then slowly increasing exposure and volumes of solids until around 1. Do you have any other perspective or thoughts on milk volumes, formula milk volumes, as you're doing these solid food introductions?
You kind of just read my mind and everything I said. I think it's also helpful for parents to hear, especially in that 6 to 9 month window, volume doesn't matter. They're getting what they need from their milk feeds, whether that's formula, breast milk, or a combination of both. That's covering your nutrition. Right now, the goal is learning. And we can't expect your baby to run a marathon the first day they go for a run. So we can't expect them to need to get any, real true volume of nutrition when they don't really have much. They don't have the skill set to do that. So on that same note, we tend to tell families for those first few months of solids, breastfeed or give a bottle first. If they're hungry, feed them with what they have the skills to take in and fill their bellies. So then when they show up at the table, it's interesting, it's fun, it's an exploratory process. They're not frustrated because they're like, oh, I'm hungry and I know this is supposed to get in my mouth and it's supposed to be into my belly, but I can't figure it out. Like, nobody learns when they're hangry, right? Like, no one can do that. So in general, we try to tell families to not mess with the milk feeds in that first 6 months of solids unless absolutely necessary. And the one main time that we find sometimes you need a little nudge is if your baby's getting to that 9-10 month window and they're really just not interested at all. They have no desire to touch food, bring it to the mouth, play with it. If they're not interested in all, that might be a time where I'm like, okay, I'm not telling you to wean, but let's maybe manipulate their hunger a little bit so they show up to the table a little bit more interested. Let's, if they're looking hungry, then maybe bring them to the table. You can always top them off with a bottle or a breastfeed, or just give them a little bottle or a breastfeed snack, then wait a little bit of time and bring them to the table. Sometimes those older infants need a little bit of a kick of hunger to actually explore. Now, sometimes we see lots of babies spitting still in that 9 to 10 month window, and parents get really nervous. Do I need to cut back on the feeds to get them to swallow more? It might work. Sometimes when you do that, they actually will swallow more food. But my gut tells me, and in my clinical experience, I feel like I've seen the gamut of the kid that starts swallowing day one, and it's like, they're off to the races, to my daughter, my second daughter, who was like 9-10 months old before she really started swallowing a lot, to my partner Carrie's daughter, who didn't really start swallowing much until like 14-15 months. And it was all normal and it was okay. And it's hard to, again, see on social media that every baby is swallowing all their foods at 6 months, but really there's a range of normal. So even if they're doing a lot of spitting, in my mind, as long as they're swallowing some textures, like, so say they're swallowing some purees, they're swallowing some mashes, they're able to manage those foods. If they're still spitting solids, they're like chewable foods because they're learning, to me, that's not a red flag. I like to give it a little bit more time. Some kids just need more time. In the same way that we don't expect every baby to walk at the same time, we're not going to expect every baby to chew and swallow every single, food at the same time either. We want to give a little bit of flexibility. So anybody here, like, give your baby some flexibility, trust that they can figure it out. Just because they're not doing it today doesn't mean that they won't do it in 2 weeks or tomorrow. It's okay. There's a big range of
Well, and I think you nailed it. There's a big range of normal. Trust your gut and advocate for yourself. So if you do feel like you have a 9-10 month old and strategies aren't working, obviously reach out, right? There's occupational therapists, speech therapists, certain lactations consultants that have that additional training. Obviously, if you have a toddler and you're still struggling, make your pediatrician aware, and there is help out there. Yeah. There are those of us in the field that specialize in this, that can do assessments, that can say, oh, actually, I think there might be a tongue tie here. Oh, we have some oral motor weakness. Maybe we had an aversion or a history, there was a choking incident, something happened, and there really is help to be able to navigate through that. So it's that yin-yang balance of there's a wide range of normal. Sometimes families just need tweaks. They were preparing a food incorrectly, or it was too big of a piece, or the flavor, or there was too much pressure. And sometimes there might actually be something underlying going on oral motor wise that could be addressed.
Yeah, and like you were saying earlier about trusting your gut, the other thing that's just a kind of an unfortunate thing about the the systems we live in is that you can't always get in to see a feeding therapist right away. So if your baby is 8 or 9 months and something in your gut is saying this just doesn't feel right, talk to your pediatrician about getting on a referral list, because it might take you a few months to find a therapist. And by the time you find the therapist, maybe your baby is doing just fine. Great, cancel the appointment. Yep. Also, in the United States, for those of you that are in the States, most all states provide completely free early intervention services. And that's self-referral. You don't even need your doctor to write you a note for that. But the wait lists for early intervention are also extremely long. So if you have a gut feeling that something's just not right, it's completely okay to ask for support. And then, like you were saying, Julie, there's so many clinicians out there that can just help you with little tiny tweaks, or say, oh, there's something that I think we need to dig a little bit deeper in here. Maybe we need to get a swallow study. Yeah. Maybe we need to see, do a better assessment of your frenulum, whatever it may be. But a lot of times there's just a small little tweak that might make all the difference, and you just need a skilled eye to look at it. Look at your baby.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. You and I could talk for hours about this.
No.
I love it. I love this topic. Obviously, I'm really passionate about it as families are making these transitions, feeding their babies. If you want to reach out to Solid Starts, it is a wonderful resource for families of figuring out how to prepare foods, different ways to prepare them, food ideas. Love what you're doing. Can't wait till the book comes out. Don't hesitate to reach out. Are you, is Carrie still doing private consultations
No,
right now? Do you know?
she,
No?
no, she moved up to Portland, Oregon, so she's also not. The other thing that we do have is if you are with some of the products that we offer, we do have one-on-one email support, so that is an option. But it's so tricky with licensure and ethics about giving like full therapeutic intervention, which is kind of tough, but we do the best we can to give as much support as possible.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention is we have a very, very robust economic need program. So if you're looking at any of our resources and you're like, oh man, I really want this, but I just can't afford it, there is a link on our website. If you type in economic need, you fill out the information, and any of our products are completely free. That's really important to us. To make sure that anybody that needs support, we're there for you. So please check that out if you need it. Like, no questions asked. It's a really important program to us. That's a like number one value, is that that's always free.
That's amazing. If you are watching and you're one of my followers and you're in the Los Angeles area, don't hesitate to reach out to me. Depending on your needs, your baby's needs, your appointments may be free under your PPO insurance plan. And if you, depending on the age of your baby, either I can work with you or I have many colleagues across the city who are speech, occupational, or physical therapists that can help you reach your baby feeding goals. Thank you so much again for coming on and talking about this. It's such an important topic. And thank you for all that you're doing in this infant feeding community.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And like you mentioned in the beginning, finding therapists that are also IBCLCs are unicorns. So if anybody has the opportunity to work with somebody like Julie, you're like in really, really good hands. It's just such a beautiful marriage of what we know from a developmental like therapist mindset, but then also pulling in this really beautiful lactation piece too. So thank you so much for the work you're doing, and say hello to LA for me.
I will. It's here. It's dry now and sunny. There's no more rain. So thank you so much. Have a really great day. And I know this is going to be such an important topic for parents because of just navigating as their babies age and stage.
Have a great day, everybody.
You too. Bye.